I didn't realize I had become his servant. Until the day I couldn't even recognize myself in the mirror anymore. My name is Evelyn. I'm 67 years old, widowed, and for most of my life, I believed that being a mother meant sacrifice. Endless sacrifice. The kind where you give and give and give, hoping that one day your child will stand on his own feet and say, "Mom, you can rest now." But that day never came. Instead, what came was something I never expected. My son turned 30, and somehow, I was still doing everything for him. Every morning used to mean something. There was a time when I would wake up early, make coffee, open the windows, feel the sunlight touching the house like a quiet blessing. Back then, life had rhythm, purpose, direction. Now mornings felt heavy, because I wasn't waking up for myself anymore. I was waking up for him, even though he wouldn't get out of bed until noon. Every single day, like clockwork, I would hear the same sound. His bedroom door opening slowly, his footsteps dragging across the hallway, followed by the same voice every time without fail. "Mom, what's for lunch?" Not "good morning." Not "how are you?" Just that. Always that. First, years ago, I didn't think much of it. I told myself he was going through a phase. That maybe life was hard, that maybe he needed time. I had lost my husband not long before, and he had lost his father. I convinced myself that what he needed was comfort. So I gave it, freely, without question. But comfort slowly became dependency. And dependency turned into expectation. By the time he was 30, my son didn't just expect meals. He demanded them. And not just any meals. "Make meat, Mom. I don't want that cheap stuff again." I still remember the first time he said it like that. The tone wasn't just casual. It wasn't a suggestion. It was authority. Like he had the right to decide what I should cook. In my own house. With my own money. First, I laughed it off. I tried to keep things light, pretending I didn't feel what I actually felt deep down. A quiet discomfort growing into something heavier. But then it became daily. "If there's no meat, I'm not eating. Why are you always making simple food? You're home all day, what else do you even do?" That one hurt the most. Because he didn't see. He didn't see the laundry I did every single day. He didn't see the ironing. He didn't see the cleaning, the groceries, the bills, the silent nights where I sat alone wondering where I had gone wrong. To him, I was just there. Like a service. Like something that existed to make his life easier. And the laundry. That became another thing. At some point, without ever asking, he just assumed it was my responsibility. "Mom, my clothes aren't washed. Mom, I need that shirt ironed. Mom, hurry up, I'm going out." Never a please. Never a thank you. And the worst part, I obeyed. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know how to stop. Because somewhere along the way I stopped being his mother. And became his maid. And the scariest part wasn't what he was doing. It was what I was allowing. 'Cause deep down, I knew something was very wrong. But I stayed silent. Until one morning, everything changed. Didn't happen all at once. That's the thing most people don't understand when they look at a situation like mine from the outside and say, "Why didn't you stop it earlier?" The truth is, nothing changes overnight. It shifts slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, until one day you wake up and realize you are no longer living your life. You are living someone else's. And that morning, as I stood in the kitchen holding a pan I had already used 3 times that day, I finally saw it clearly. Not just what he was doing, but what I had become. He walked in like he always did, wearing the same wrinkled shirt he had thrown on the floor the night before, scrolling through his phone as if the world existed inside that small screen and nowhere else. He didn't look at me, didn't ask anything, didn't even acknowledge that I had been awake for hours already, cleaning, organizing, preparing everything before he even opened his eyes. He just sat down, leaned back in the chair and said, "Is the meat ready?" And there it was again, that word. Re. Not food. Not lunch. Re. Like everything I did had to revolve around his demands, like my effort only mattered if it met his expectations. I remember looking at him in that moment, really looking at him, not as the little boy I once raised, but as the man he had become. 30 years old. Strong, healthy, fully capable. And yet, completely dependent. Not because he couldn't survive on his own, but because he had learned that he didn't have to. 'Cause I had made it too easy. Because every time life demanded something from him, I stepped in and removed the obstacle. And slowly, without realizing, I didn't raise a man. I maintained a boy. The realization hit me harder than I expected, not as anger, but as a deep, heavy sadness that settled in my chest and refused to leave. Because it wasn't just about him. It was about me. About every time I chose silence instead of confrontation. About every time I told myself, this is temporary, even as the years passed. About every excuse I created to justify what was clearly becoming a problem. And the most painful part of all was understanding that he wasn't the only one responsible for this situation. I was part of it. I had allowed it to grow. He started complaining again, something about the food taking too long, something about how other mothers took better care of their sons, and that's when I felt something shift inside me. Not explosive, not dramatic, but quiet and firm, like a door closing slowly but permanently. For the first time in years, I didn't rush. I didn't apologize. I didn't try to fix the situation immediately. I just stood there, listening, observing, absorbing every word. And realizing that the way he spoke to me was not normal. It was not respectful. It was not something a grown man should ever feel comfortable saying to his own mother. And then came the sentence that I couldn't ignore anymore. If you can't even do this right, what's the point of you staying home all day? He said it casually, almost bored, as if it meant nothing. But to me it meant everything. Because in that moment, I understood that in his eyes, I wasn't his mother anymore. I was a function, role, something that existed to serve, to provide, to maintain his comfort. And if I failed at that, then I had no value. I didn't respond. Not because I agreed, but because I finally understood that reacting the way I always had, defending, explaining, trying to prove my worth, would only keep the cycle alive. Instead, I turned off the stove, wiped my hands slowly on a towel, and walked out of the kitchen without saying a single word. And behind me, I could hear his voice, confused, slightly irritated, calling my name as if I had broken an unspoken rule. That was the first time in years that I didn't obey. And even though it was a small moment, something almost invisible to anyone watching from the outside, for me it was the beginning of something much bigger. Because silence, when used the right way, isn't weakness. It's preparation. And for the first time in a long time, I was no longer just enduring. I was observing. And I was starting to change. The next morning didn't feel different on the outside. The sun still came through the curtains, the house was still quiet, and everything looked exactly the same. But inside me, something had already shifted. It wasn't anger, it wasn't rebellion. It was clarity. The kind that doesn't scream, doesn't rush, doesn't need to prove anything. Simply exists, firm and undeniable. And for the first time in years, I woke up and didn't immediately think about what he needed. I thought about what I was going to stop doing. I didn't prepare breakfast. I didn't check his laundry. I didn't walk into his room to pick up the clothes scattered on the floor like I had done for years without even questioning it. Instead, I made my own coffee, sat down at the table, and allowed myself something I hadn't felt in a long time. Stillness. Not the exhausted stillness of someone who has nothing left to give, but the calm of someone who is finally choosing not to give everything away. When he woke up, everything followed the same pattern at first. The slow footsteps, the door opening, the dragging sound across the hallway. But this time something was missing. The smell of food, the sound of pans, the invisible signal that everything was ready for him. He walked into the kitchen, paused, looked around, and for a brief second, there was confusion in his eyes, as if reality had slightly shifted and he didn't understand why. "Mom!" he called, his voice carrying that familiar tone of expectation. Not concern, not curiosity, expectation. I didn't answer immediately. I took another sip of my coffee, feeling the silence settle between us like something new, something unfamiliar. When I finally looked at him, I didn't smile. I didn't rush. I didn't explain. I just said calmly, "There's food in the fridge. You can heat it." That moment was the beginning of the storm. He stared at me as if I had said something absurd, something completely out of character. And in a way I had. Because for him I wasn't supposed to change. I wasn't supposed to set boundaries. I wasn't supposed to remind him that he was capable of taking care of himself. I was supposed to continue, endlessly, fulfilling the role he had assigned to me. "What do you mean heat it?" he asked, his voice tightening, irritation creeping in. "Why didn't you make something fresh?" I held his gaze, not with aggression, not with defiance, but with something much more unsettling, calm certainty. "Because you can do it," I replied. And that's when his expression changed. Not into understanding, not into reflection, but into resistance. He laughed, short and dry, shaking his head as if I was the one being unreasonable. "You're serious," he said. "You've been home all morning. What were you doing?" That question used to break me. It used to make me feel small, defensive, like I had to justify every second of my existence. But not anymore. Because for the first time I realized something simple, something obvious, something I had ignored for too long. I didn't owe him an explanation. "I was living," I said quietly. He didn't like that answer. Not because it was wrong, but because it didn't fit the version of me he was used to controlling. The tension in the room grew thicker, heavier, pressing against the walls like something waiting to explode. He opened the fridge, looked inside, slammed it shut, then opened it again as if expecting the situation to magically correct itself. But nothing changed. The food was there. The responsibility was there. And for the first time, it was his. "You're acting weird," he said, turning back to me, now clearly annoyed. "What's wrong with you?" There it was. The moment where the roles tried to flip. Where my change became the problem. Where my silence, my boundary, my decision to stop, was treated as dysfunction. And years ago I would have folded right there. I would have apologized, rushed to the stove, tried to restore the balance he was comfortable with. But this time I didn't move. I didn't argue. I didn't justify. I simply stayed where I was. And let him face something he had avoided his entire life. Responsibility. He stood there for a few seconds longer, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to return to the version of myself he knew. But when I didn't, he turned away, muttering something under his breath, frustrated, uncomfortable, lost in a situation he didn't know how to control. And as I watched him struggle with something as simple as heating his own meal, I understood something deeper. This wasn't just about food. This wasn't just about laundry. This was about power. And for the first time, I was taking mine back. The change didn't go unnoticed. That's the thing about breaking a pattern, especially one that has been in place for years. The moment you stop playing your role, the other person doesn't suddenly adapt. They react. And not with understanding, not with maturity, but with resistance. Because what you're really doing isn't just changing your behavior. You're disrupting the comfort they've built their entire life around. And for my son, that comfort was me. That afternoon, the atmosphere in the house felt different. Not loud, not explosive, but tense, like something unspoken was hanging in the air. He barely looked at me when he passed through the living room, but I could feel it. The irritation, the discomfort, the silent question he hadn't figured out how to ask yet. "Why are you not doing what you're supposed to do?" But what he didn't realize was that the question itself was the problem. Later that evening he finally approached me. Not calmly, not respectfully, but with that same tone he always used when something didn't go his way. Half complaint, half accusation. "I don't know what's gotten into you lately," he said, leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, trying to sound in control but clearly unsettled. "You've been acting different. Not cooking properly, not keeping up with things. It's like you just stopped caring." That word, caring, it almost made me smile. 'Cause for years I had cared too much. And that's exactly what had brought us here. I looked at him, really looked at him again, trying to understand how someone I raised could speak to me like that without even noticing it. But then I remembered this wasn't new. The words were new, the tone was sharper. But the mindset had been there for a long time. It had just grown stronger because I never challenged it. "I haven't stopped caring," I said calmly. "I've just stopped doing everything for you." The silence that followed was immediate. Heavy. Uncomfortable. And for the first time I could see something in his expression that I hadn't seen before. Not confidence, not entitlement, but uncertainty. He wasn't used to resistance. "What do you mean everything?" he shot back quickly, his voice rising slightly, as if raising it would somehow restore control. "You're my mother. This is what you're supposed to do." That sentence, that belief, that was the core of everything. And hearing it out loud made it impossible to ignore. "No," I said, still calm, still steady. "That's what I chose to do. And I chose it for too long." He shook his head, pacing now, agitated, as if the ground beneath him had shifted and he couldn't find his footing anymore. "So what, now you're just going to stop? Just like that? After all these years?" And there it was. Not gratitude, not reflection, but expectation, disguised as disappointment. "Yes," I replied. One word. Clear. Final. And that's when he changed tactics. Because when control doesn't work, manipulation usually comes next. He sighed loudly, ran his hand through his hair, and his tone softened, but not in a genuine way. It was strategic, almost rehearsed, like he was stepping into a different role. "I've been going through things too, you know," he said, avoiding eye contact now. "It's not easy out there. You think I want to be like this? You think I enjoy not having everything figured out?" That almost reached me. Almost. Because a part of me still wanted to believe him, still wanted to protect, to comfort, to step back into the role I knew so well. But this time I didn't let that part take control. Because I finally understood something important. His struggles might be real, but the way he treated me was a choice. "I understand that life is hard," I said quietly. "But that doesn't give you the right to treat me like I exist to serve you." That hit him. Could see it. Not because he agreed, but because he wasn't expecting me to say it. "You're overreacting," he replied quickly, defensive again, trying to push the responsibility back onto me. "I never said that." "You didn't have to," I answered. And that's when the room fell silent again. But this time, it wasn't the same silence as before. This silence had weight, truth, and something else, something new. Distance. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't just seeing him as my son. I was seeing him as a man responsible for his own actions. And that changes everything. He stood there for a moment longer, as if trying to find something else to say, something that would bring things back to the way they were. But there was nothing left. Not because the conversation was over, but because the illusion was. And as he walked away, frustrated, confused, and no longer in control, I realized something I had been avoiding for a long time. This wasn't going to be easy. He wasn't going to change overnight. And the more I stood my ground, the more he would resist. But this time, I wasn't afraid of that. 'Cause for the first time, I wasn't afraid of losing the version of him that only existed because I kept enabling it. There's a point in every situation like this where the problem reveals its true shape. And in my case, it wasn't just about food, laundry, or respect. It was about something deeper, something that had been silently feeding the entire dynamic for years. And that something was money. Because the truth I had been avoiding, the one I didn't want to say out loud, was simple and uncomfortable. My son wasn't just living in my house. He was living off my life. I started noticing it more clearly after our last conversation. The groceries disappearing faster than they should. The electricity bill climbing higher every month. The small things I used to ignore, like late-night food orders, unnecessary expenses, and the way he spent money he didn't earn as if it came from an endless source. And in a way it did. 'Cause I had become that source. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a stack of bills in front of me, something I had done countless times before, but never with the same awareness. For years, I managed everything quietly, adjusting here, cutting there, making sure nothing ever reached him as a problem. I protected him from reality. And in doing so, I disconnected him from it completely. He walked in like always, casual, unconcerned, scrolling through his phone, and without even looking up he said, "Hey, I need some money." No hesitation. No explanation. Just expectation. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment I didn't respond. Not because I didn't hear him, but because I was absorbing the weight of that sentence. A 30-year-old man standing in front of his mother, asking for money as if it was routine, as if it required no justification, no accountability, no awareness of what it meant. For what? I asked calmly. He sighed, already irritated by the fact that I had even asked. "Just stuff," he replied. "I'm going out later. I don't have anything right now." That answer used to be enough. It used to be all I needed to reach for my wallet, hand him what he asked for and move on. But now it sounded empty, vague, avoidant, and more importantly, disrespectful. "No," I said. The word landed harder than anything I had said before. He looked up immediately, confused at first, then annoyed. "What do you mean no?" "I mean no," I repeated, my voice steady, my posture unchanged. "I'm not giving you money." The shift in his expression was immediate. Not just frustration but disbelief. Because in his world, that wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to say no. I wasn't supposed to create resistance. I was supposed to continue. "Are you serious right now?" he asked, his tone sharper now, stepping closer. "It's not even a big deal. I'll pay you back." I held his gaze. "You've never paid me back." Silence. Not the quiet kind. The uncomfortable kind. The kind that exposes truth without needing to say anything else. He looked away for a second, then laughed, but there was no humor in it, just tension. "So now you're keeping score," he said, trying to flip the narrative, trying to make me look unreasonable for noticing what had been happening for years. "No," I replied calmly. "I'm paying attention." That hit differently. Because there's no argument against awareness. There's no manipulation that works when the other person finally sees clearly. "You're acting like I'm some kind of burden," he snapped, his voice rising now, the frustration no longer hidden. "I'm your son. You're supposed to help me." That word again. Posed. Expectation disguised as obligation. "I have helped you," I said. "For years." "And what, now you're just done?" he shot back quickly. "Yes." No hesitation. No explanation. No apology. And that's when the energy in the room changed completely. Because this time, it wasn't just about a meal. It wasn't just about a shirt. It was about access. And for the first time in his life, I was closing the door. He stepped back slightly, shaking his head, clearly trying to process what was happening, but unable to accept it. "This is crazy," he muttered. "You're really going to do this now? After everything?" That sentence carried weight. Because after everything wasn't about what he had done. It was about what he had gotten used to. And that difference changes everything. Yes, I said quietly. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear, not guilt, not doubt, but control. Not over him, but over myself. 'Cause for the first time, I wasn't reacting to his needs. I was responding to my own limits. And that changes the entire dynamic. He stood there for a few seconds longer, staring at me as if I had become someone else entirely. But the truth was, I hadn't become someone new. I had just stopped being someone I was never supposed to be. And as he turned away, frustrated, silent, and no longer in control of the situation, I realized something that made everything clear. This was no longer about helping him grow. This was about forcing him to face reality. And whether he was ready or not, that moment had already begun. The next phase didn't come with shouting or chaos, at least not at first. It came quietly, in a tone that almost sounded wounded, almost sincere, the kind of tone that used to disarm me instantly, because for years I confused vulnerability with manipulation. And that's exactly where he went next, because when control no longer works through routine, it often tries to return through emotion. And that night, as I sat alone in the living room, finally allowing myself a moment of silence that didn't belong to anyone else, he walked in slower than usual, not dragging his feet this time, but measured, deliberate, like someone choosing his next move carefully. And without looking directly at me, he said, "You've changed." And there was something in the way he said it that almost made me doubt myself, not because the words were powerful, but because of what they were trying to trigger inside me, that old reflex, that instinct to explain, to soften, to step back into the version of myself that would immediately reassure him. But I stayed still, and that silence forced him to continue. "You're not the same anymore," he added, now looking at me, searching for something, maybe guilt, maybe hesitation, maybe the version of me that used to fold under pressure. But what he found instead was something he didn't recognize, something calm, grounded, and no longer available for that dynamic. And that's when he shifted again, going deeper, aiming where he knew it used to hurt the most. "I don't even feel like you care about me anymore," he said, and that sentence, that exact sentence, had worked on me for years. It had been enough to undo any boundary I tried to create, enough to make me question myself, enough to pull me back into giving more than I should. But this time, instead of reacting, I observed, I listened not just to what he was saying, but to what was underneath it. And underneath it wasn't pain, it was expectation. It was the assumption that love meant obedience, that care meant service, that being a mother meant never saying no. And once I saw that clearly, something inside me settled in a way it never had before. And when I finally spoke, my voice didn't carry anger or defensiveness. It carried something much more unsettling, something he couldn't argue with. "I do care about you," I said slowly. "But caring about you doesn't mean destroying myself for you." And that sentence landed differently, because it didn't attack him, it didn't accuse, it simply removed the illusion he had been operating under. And for a moment, he didn't respond, not because he agreed, but because he didn't have a ready script for that kind of answer. And when people lose their script, they lose control, and that's exactly what started happening. He looked away, exhaled sharply, then came back with something stronger, something heavier. "So what, now I'm just a problem to you?" he said, his voice rising again, trying to push me into a corner, trying to force me into either denying it or over-explaining. But I didn't do either, because I finally understood that I didn't have to choose between being a good mother and being a whole person. "No," I replied, steady, "but the way things have been is a problem." And there it was again, that pause, that crack in the dynamic, that moment where the usual patterns didn't apply anymore. And I could see it in his face, the frustration, the confusion, the subtle shift from confidence to discomfort, because for the first time, he wasn't dealing with the version of me he had learned to navigate. He was facing someone new, someone who didn't react the way he expected, someone who didn't collapse under guilt. And that's when the tone changed completely. No more softness, no more pretending, just raw resistance. "This is unbelievable," he said, shaking his head, pacing now, trying to release the tension he didn't know how to control. "After everything I've been through, this is how you treat me." And that sentence might have worked before, it might have pulled me back into the same cycle, but now I could see it clearly, not as a cry for help, but as a tool, a way to shift responsibility, a way to avoid facing reality. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel responsible for fixing. That I didn't feel obligated to absorb it. I didn't feel the need to carry something that wasn't mine, and that changed everything, because when you stop carrying what isn't yours, the other person is forced to feel the weight of it themselves, and he wasn't ready for that, not at all. And as he stood there waiting for me to react, waiting for me to step back into the role he needed me to play, I did the one thing that completely broke the pattern. I didn't argue, I didn't defend, I didn't explain. I simply stood up, looked at him calmly and said, "You're going to have to figure things out." And then I walked away, leaving him there, in a silence that no longer belonged to me, but to him, and that silence was heavier than anything I could have said. The explosion didn't come immediately after that conversation, because tension like that doesn't always break right away. It builds, it compresses, it stretches the limits of what both people can tolerate until something finally gives. And in my case, it happened the following afternoon, when the house was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful but heavy, like something is waiting just beneath the surface. And I was in the kitchen again, not cooking for him this time, but preparing something simple for myself, something small, intentional, almost symbolic, when I heard his footsteps coming faster than usual, not dragging, not lazy, but sharp, direct, and before I could even turn around, his voice cut through the room, louder than it had been in years. "So this is it now," he said, and there was no softness left, no attempt to mask what he was feeling, just raw frustration. "You're just going to pretend I don't exist. Stop doing everything. Act like I'm some stranger in this house?" And I turned slowly, not reacting to the volume, not matching his energy, because I had already crossed that internal line where his reactions no longer dictated mine, and I simply said, "I'm not pretending anything, I'm just no longer doing what I shouldn't have been doing all this time." And that answer hit something deeper than anything I had said before, because this time he didn't try to manipulate. He didn't try to soften it, he went straight into confrontation, stepping closer, his voice rising, his body tense. "You're unbelievable," he snapped. "After everything I've gone through, after losing Dad, after everything, this is when you decide to turn your back on me?" And for a brief moment, that mention of his father passed through me like a shadow, because grief had been the foundation of everything we had built after that loss. It had been the excuse, the justification, the silent agreement that allowed things to become what they had become. But this time, instead of letting that memory pull me back, I faced it differently. I acknowledged it without surrendering to it, and I said, calm but firm, "Losing your father didn't turn you into this, staying stuck did." And that was it. That was the sentence that broke whatever was left of the old dynamic, because his reaction was immediate, explosive, uncontrollable. "Don't talk to me like that," he shouted, his voice echoing through the house, something I hadn't heard since he was a teenager, but this time it wasn't immaturity, it was resistance to reality. "You think you're better than me now? You think you've figured everything out?" And I didn't step back, I didn't lower my gaze, I didn't retreat into silence the way I used to. I stayed exactly where I was, grounded, present, unshaken, because this wasn't about winning an argument, it was about not losing myself again. And that's when he crossed the final line, the one that made everything unmistakably clear. "If you're going to act like this," he said, breathing heavily, anger and frustration mixing into something unstable, "then maybe I shouldn't even be here." And there it was, the threat, not just of leaving the room, but of leaving the house, of breaking the last layer of control he thought he still had, because for years, the idea of him leaving would have terrified me. It would have made me panic, apologize, pull him back at any cost, but now it didn't, and that was the moment everything truly changed, because instead of reacting, instead of trying to stop him, instead of begging him to stay, I looked at him, steady, clear, and I said something I never thought I would say in my entire life. "Then maybe it's time." And the silence that followed was unlike anything we had ever experienced, not tense, not chaotic, but final, because in that moment, he realized something he had never had to face before, that I was no longer afraid of losing him, not because I didn't love him, but because I finally understood that keeping him like this wasn't love at all. And as he stood there, staring at me, searching for hesitation, for doubt, for any sign that I would take it back, he found nothing, and that absence, that calm certainty, shook him more than any argument ever could, because for the first time in his life, the safety net wasn't guaranteed anymore. After that moment, something in the house shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. not because of what was said, but because of what was finally understood. And the silence that followed wasn't temporary. It wasn't the kind that fades after a few hours or gets covered by routine. It was a different kind of silence, one that forces both people to confront what they've been avoiding, and for the rest of that day we barely crossed paths, not out of avoidance, but because neither of us knew how to step back into something that no longer existed. And that night, as I sat alone in my room, I didn't feel guilt the way I used to. I didn't feel the urge to fix things, to smooth it over, to restore what had always been familiar. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Clarity, the kind that comes when you finally stop negotiating against yourself. And I realized that this couldn't stay in words alone, because boundaries that are only spoken but not lived disappear. They get tested, pushed, ignored until they mean nothing again. And I knew that if I didn't act now, everything would slowly return to what it had been, just with more tension, more resentment, more damage. And I wasn't willing to go back to that. Not anymore. So the next morning, before he even woke up, I did something I had never done in 30 years. I sat down and wrote everything out, not as a complaint, not as an emotional outburst, but as a decision, clear, structured, undeniable. I wrote down what would change in this house from that day forward. I wrote that I would no longer cook for him unless he contributed, that I would not wash or iron his clothes, that any expenses he had would be his responsibility, and that if he chose to stay, it would be under those conditions, not as punishment, not as revenge, but as reality. And when I finished writing, I didn't feel fear. I felt something much stronger, alignment, because for the first time my actions were matching what I knew deep down was right. And when he finally woke up and walked into the kitchen, expecting the same pattern, the same routine, the same version of me, he found that paper on the table waiting, and I didn't explain it immediately. I didn't soften it. I didn't stand there trying to justify every line. I simply let him read it, and I watched as his expression shifted slowly, from confusion to disbelief, from disbelief to resistance, and finally, to something he couldn't hide, realization, because this time it wasn't just words. It wasn't just a conversation he could argue against or manipulate. It was structure. It was consequence. It was a version of reality he couldn't ignore. And when he looked up at me, ready to react, ready to push back, ready to test if this was real or just another moment that would fade, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't change my tone. I just said, "This is how it is now." And that sentence didn't need anything else, because it wasn't emotional. It wasn't reactive. It was final. And for the first time, he didn't explode. He didn't argue immediately. He just stood there, holding that paper, trying to process what it meant, because something inside him understood that this wasn't temporary, that this wasn't something he could wait out, that this wasn't the same cycle repeating itself. And in that moment, I realized something that changed everything. Not just about him, but about myself. This wasn't about forcing him to change. This was about refusing to stay the same. And whether he adapted or not, whether he stayed or left, whether he resisted or accepted, my decision didn't depend on that anymore, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't making a choice based on fear or guilt or obligation. I was making it based on truth, and that truth was simple, clear, and impossible to ignore. I deserved peace in my own home, and I was finally willing to protect it. He didn't argue right away, and that was what made everything feel even more real, because for the first time, his silence wasn't resistance building up to an explosion. It was something else. Processing, confusion, maybe even the first contact with a reality he had avoided his entire adult life. And as he stood there holding that paper, reading the same lines again as if hoping they would somehow change, I could see it clearly. The moment where expectation met limitation, where the version of me he depended on no longer existed. And when he finally spoke, his voice wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, it was something colder, something more distant. "So that's it then," he said, not really asking, just confirming what he already understood. And I didn't add anything, I didn't soften it, I didn't explain further, because there was nothing left to negotiate. And that absence of negotiation, that lack of emotional back and forth, made everything heavier, more final. And he nodded slowly, almost to himself, as if accepting something he didn't want but couldn't deny anymore. And without another word, he turned and walked back to his room, closing the door behind him in a way that wasn't dramatic, but decisive. And the house fell into a silence that felt different from all the others, because this one carried the weight of a real ending. For the next hour I stayed where I was, not frozen, not anxious, just present, listening to the sounds coming from his room, drawers opening, things being moved, footsteps that were no longer slow or careless but purposeful, and with every sound, the reality settled deeper. He was leaving, not threatening, not testing, but actually leaving, and I didn't stop him, not because I didn't care, but because for the first time, I understood that stopping him would only continue the cycle we had both been trapped in, and sometimes the most difficult form of love is allowing distance to exist. When he finally came out, he had a bag in his hand, not packed with care, not organized, just enough to leave, enough to create separation, and he didn't look at me immediately. He walked toward the door, paused for a second, as if waiting for something. Maybe for me to call his name, to say wait, to undo everything that had just been set in motion, but I didn't, and when he turned to look at me, there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not entitlement, but something closer to uncertainty, like someone stepping into a world they don't fully understand yet. "This is what you wanted," he said, not as an accusation, but as a statement shaped by his own interpretation. "No," I replied, calm, steady, without hesitation. "This is what needed to happen." That answer stayed in the air between us, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, and for a moment, it felt like time slowed, like everything we had been avoiding for years was finally standing there, fully visible, impossible to ignore. And then he nodded once, small, almost imperceptible, and turned the handle. The door opened, and just like that he stepped out. No shouting, no final argument, no dramatic goodbye. Just a quiet exit that carried more weight than anything else could have. The door closed behind him with a sound so simple, so ordinary. But for me, it marked the end of something that had defined my life for far too long. And then came the silence. Real silence. Not the kind filled with tension or expectation, but the kind that breathes. The kind that allows space. The kind that, for the first time in years, belonged to me. I stood there for a while, not moving, not rushing to fill the emptiness, not reaching for my phone, not questioning my decision, just standing in the middle of a house that finally felt like it was mine again, and slowly, something unexpected began to rise inside me. Not guilt, not fear, not regret, but peace. Quiet, steady peace. The kind that doesn't need to justify itself. The kind that comes when you finally stop abandoning yourself for someone else. And in that moment, I understood something that changed everything. I hadn't lost my son. I had stopped losing myself. And sometimes, that's where real change begins. Months passed in a way I never thought they would, not fast, not slow, but steady, like a life that no longer needed to rush or collapse under pressure. And in that time, something inside me reorganized itself, not dramatically, not in a way that others would immediately notice, but deeply, quietly, in the kind of way that changes how you breathe, how you sit in your own home, how you exist when no one is asking anything from you. And for the first time in decades, I started to rediscover what it meant to live without constant tension, without the invisible weight of someone else's expectations shaping every decision I made. I began cooking when I wanted, not when I was demanded to. I left dishes in the sink without feeling urgency. I sat down in the afternoon and allowed silence to exist without guilt. And that silence became something beautiful, not empty, but full of space, full of presence, full of something I had forgotten I was allowed to have, peace. At first, I wondered about him more than I expected, not with anxiety, not with desperation, but with a quiet curiosity that would come and go, small thoughts during the day, brief questions at night, wondering where he was, how he was managing, whether he was struggling, whether he had finally encountered the reality I had tried to shield him from for so long. And sometimes those thoughts carried a trace of sadness, because no matter what had happened, he was still my son, and that bond doesn't disappear just because the dynamic changes, but something important had shifted. I no longer felt responsible for fixing his life, and that difference allowed me to think of him without losing myself in the process. Then one afternoon, without warning, my phone rang, and when I saw his name on the screen, time seemed to pause for a second, not out of fear, not out of urgency, but because I knew deep down that whatever came next would not be the same as before. And when I answered, there was a silence on the other end, longer than usual, heavier than expected, and then his voice came through different, not in a dramatic way, but in something much more subtle and real. "Hey, Mom," he said, and that pause between the words carried more meaning than anything else he could have said. We didn't speak long, not that day, not in a way that tried to resolve everything all at once, but there was something in his tone, something in the way he chose his words more carefully, something in the absence of demand, the absence of expectation, the absence of that familiar entitlement that had defined our relationship for so long, and I realized that distance had done something I never could, forced him to face himself, to experience life without the safety net I had always provided, and whether he had fully changed or not didn't matter in that moment, because what mattered was that the pattern had been broken. After the call ended, I didn't sit there analyzing every word, I didn't build expectations about what would happen next, I didn't rush into hope or fear, I simply placed the phone down and looked around my home, my space, my life, and for the first time I saw it clearly. Not as a place of obligation, not as a structure built around someone else's needs, but as something that belonged to me, something I had reclaimed piece by piece, decision by decision, silence by silence. And in that moment, I understood something that no one had ever taught me, something I had to learn the hard way, through years of giving too much and finally choosing to stop. Love is not sacrifice without limits. Love is not service without respect. And love should never cost you your own life. Because when you finally choose yourself, you don't lose the people who truly matter. You just lose the version of them that was never meant to stay. If this story made you feel something, it's because you've seen it before. Maybe in your own life. Maybe in someone close to you. And the truth is, most people stay silent for too long. But sometimes the moment you choose yourself is the moment everything finally begins to change. If you believe respect should go both ways, if you believe love should never feel like a burden, subscribe to the channel, because the next story might hit even closer than this one.